Ever since humans roamed the earth, they have always tried to make new weapons to live longer and make their lives easier. And the more you move forward towards history, the better these tools get. We keep moving forward until we get to the First World War and Second World War. Even though most weapons are modernized at this point, but people were still trying to figure out new ways to win the battle. They were always trying to figure out a way to create a weapon that their enemy didn't have. Even something simple. In the Second World War, a general named John O'Daniel was fighting the Italians, and the Italians would attack the Americans by using torpedoes. When the general was confronted with the shells of these torpedoes, an idea popped in his head, and he told his men to cut these shells in half because I need to do something with them. After he sees what it is, he orders 10 more of these torpedoes to be made, and he also tells his men to use metal pipes to connect each other and add a tow attachment to it. When you look at this, you see a bunch of caskets behind the tank and it's being pulled through a field. These half torpedoes were made in a way where a soldier could lay in there with all their weapons, ready to have a fight. 12 soldiers with a lot of weapons are moving towards the battlefield, and the enemy has no idea that these men are back there. It seems like the tank is pulling a farm equipment behind it. It's interesting to know that on the Eastern Front, the Russians were using something similar, but for the snow. Before this, the soldiers were supposed to run and walk behind the tank with all that equipment, and it was a high chance of getting hit in these fields. With the help of this invention, the soldiers could rest in these little casket-looking things and be ready to have a fight. The soldier up front had a cable in his hands, and if things got sketchy or if they wanted to release from the tank, he would just pull the cable and it would stop. After General O'Daniels figured this invention out, 360 of these were made, and it was used in different battles. They used this invention for a few years, and eventually it was put away. And the main reason it wasn't used anymore was because it couldn't pass by any obstacle. It would get stuck if there was a lot of obstacles in the way. Let's go to the 1950s. The US Navy is looking for a control tower where it can see what is happening in the battlefield, kind of like a scissor lift. This is the concept that the US Navy made back then. There's a massive fan underneath the soldier, and he can sit on the platform and fly it up and down. The US Navy liked this design, and that is why they ordered the same concept vehicle to Hiller Aircraft Design. In the 1954, Hiller comes out with the VZ-1 Pawnee. You could say this is one of the first helicopters. At this point, helicopters were being made, but they weren't actually being used because they were considered a concept vehicle. The way Hiller Company designed this aircraft is very interesting. Whichever direction you pushed your foot, it would turn to that direction. If you push right, it goes right. If you push both of them, you go forward and vice versa. It was an interesting design and was properly made, but the US Navy realized that it's too dangerous for having something like this in the battlefield, and that is why they scrapped the idea. For the third invention, let's go to the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States are looking for new tools so they can win this cold battle. Ever since the Cold War began, the Americans were always looking for an aircraft that could go up and down vertically without actually landing like an airplane. The company called Convair designs this concept for an aircraft carrier. It was called the XFY Pogo, and it looked something very sketchy. This is an odd looking airplane that lands vertically, and it seems like it's a half helicopter, half missile, half airplane. When they designed the XFY one Pogo, they told a bunch of aircraft pilots to test this thing out, and a lot of them declined, and they said they prefer not to. Nobody was willing to test this thing out for the very first time, and after 4 months, eventually a pilot had the guts to actually test it. A pilot named James F. Coleman. The interior of the aircraft is very similar to a fighter jet, but it just lifts vertically, and instead of seeing in front of you, you're looking at the sky. The first test consisted of going up and down to make sure it's stable, and then it's brought back down, which is the hardest part. But a month later, they were gonna test it the vertical phase, and it was being done by the same pilot. James Coleman successfully flies this thing and goes full vertical with it, and he actually landed it perfectly the first time. Convair designs this same aircraft with a jet engine as well. They test this and it was very successful as well. But there was one huge problem, and that was a pilot. Because not just any pilot could fly this thing, and landing it and getting up is the hardest part because you can't look in front of you. Let's go look at the British and see what kind of inventions they came up with. The British Navy was the strongest navy for a couple of centuries, and their specialty was they would get near a port to an empire they wanted to take over and start blasting with cannons. Most of their invention was in this department as well. You're probably familiar with D-Day, where they wanted to take over Normandy from the sea, and that is why this double wheel was made. This thing was called the Great Panjandrum, and it had a lot of explosions inside it. It was gonna propel itself with the help of a bunch of tiny rockets, and it would start spinning towards its target. Just like the good old days, the British were gonna launch this thing from the sea, and with the rockets, it would fly through the water and enter the beach and hit the enemy and explode. They very quickly realized that this is a terrible idea because the tiny rockets that would propel it would misfire and it would go a wrong direction, causing it to fall over. So this would do more damage than good in a Normandy takeover. In World War II, the British were always looking for cheap weapons that would do a lot of destruction, like destroying German dams, bringing a ship down with something cheap. In World War II, when they wanted to attack submarines or ships, they would shoot torpedoes. But in World War II, there was a lot of torpedo nuts everywhere that would stop these things from hitting anything. So it wasn't as effective as before. That is the reason the British were looking for a weapon that would fly over the water rather than inside it, so nothing would stop it. It's kind of like when you skip a rock on an empty river, this thing jumps over, skips, and then it hits something. This is the exact idea the British used for this weapon. The name of the project was also called the Bouncing Bomb. This weapon was made and it was considered a great idea. The bomb was basically in a form of a barrel filled with explosives. The airplane would fly extremely low on top of the water and release. The British were able to destroy more than 10 German dams with the help of this little barrel. It was also extremely dangerous as well, because the airplane had to fly extremely low to the ground before releasing the bomb. And sometimes when the bomb would hit the water for the first time, it would bounce up and actually crash into the airplane itself. All these designs we showed you in the video have all been discontinued or scrapped. But the real question is, maybe the simplest idea in a battle could be the most useful. What do you guys think?